Good. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Engineering Container Security session. If you have any trouble with the audio, just let us know. This particular session seems to be particularly timely. Not only is this a burning issue for many in the enterprise, we're seeing more enterprise workloads going into containers, but this week, of course, we had the announcement of the Kata containers, which addresses the issue as well. I think it says something about where we are in the adoption of OpenStack, that these enterprise issues such as security are taking a front row. And today we have a stellar panel of experts in this area. We expect it to be very conversational, and we'll get to questions and answers a little bit earlier than usual, so if you can think of some questions, that would be great. I just want to introduce everybody, and this is going to take a second. Hold on. Technology. Okay. So let me just introduce the panel. We want to start here with Scott McCarty, who is from Red Hat, and focuses on containers and container security. Am I right?
Yeah. So I'm Scott McCarty. I work at Red Hat. I'm a product manager for, I call it the bucket of container parts, like all of the little parts that go into like the runtime and engine and all of these things that we do in the operating system for containers. And focused on security for a long time.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you. And then Maya Kaczorowski?
Yeah, I'm Maya Kaczorowski. I'm a product manager at Google. I'm on the security team, and I work on containers specifically. So what happens to containers when they're running production? How do we build better defaults in Kubernetes, et cetera?
In fact, and you also presented yesterday.
I presented yesterday.
Which was great. Okay, and then Gu Rao.
Hi, my name is Gu Rao. I'm the CTO at Portworx. I'm not a security expert like the rest of the panel, but we get involved with security a lot, especially when it comes to data that's mounted inside of a container. So I have a couple of things that we've learned in production on how to manage containers and securing the data that they access that hopefully I can share with you guys today.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Robert?
Yes, I'm Robert Starmer. I run a cloud consultancy, and we obviously work with folks that are trying to understand all the different technologies in cloud. Containers that is the question today. How do I deal with this? And of course, if I start dealing with it, how am I dealing with security, data protection, all the sorts of things that come around that, along with how do I run these things in any kind of scale. So.
Right. So let me just take a minute to talk about some of the key topics that you all will be discussing as we have the session here. Clearly, we're going to talk about security challenges in general. I mean, it's not just a matter of what we do inside the container, but also how we have a security policy and so on for our organization and how we have to support that policy. We would like to talk about best practices, which have to do with roles, access, key management, software tools, all of the above. We want to talk about the changing role, of course, for DevOps and DevSecOps. Certainly those DevSecOps people are going to have to pay a lot of attention to what's going on with containers. We want to talk about replicating or avoiding the replication of security gaps within the containers. We want to talk about containers at rest and at runtime. And we also want to talk about multi-factor security issues, which to tackle first. It isn't, as I say, a one-size-fits-all. It really nests into an overall security policy. And finally, we hope to share knowledge and best practices today among the panel. So I'd like to throw out the first question to the panel and see how they respond to that. What are the key issues associated with container security? As we were saying, it isn't just a simple matter. There are different layers of technology to attack. And I don't know, Maya, do you want to start with that?
Sure, I can talk a bit about how we're thinking about it at Google. We're thinking about container security as three main pillars. The first one is what we'll call like infrastructure security. So is my container secure? Is my infrastructure good for developing containers? And it's things that you're all familiar with, like networking and secret management and identities and all that kind of stuff, right? And for us, it's a lot of features that we're building into Kubernetes, but you would have had for VMs as well. The second category is what we're calling software supply chain, which is making sure that your images are vulnerability-free and secure to build and deploy. And it's things like vulnerability scanning, attestation, provenance, et cetera. And the third area is what we're calling container runtime security, or is my container secure to run? And it's about how you detect something bad happening in a container while it's running. How do you alert on that, mitigate it, do forensics after the fact, et cetera.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Scott, comments there?
Well, so I guess I'll go a layer deeper because ours are actually quite similar to yours. So like, it's probably no point in me repeating. But we call ours control, defend, extend. But we have like a very similar model. But going into like the development cycle, I'd say like probably that's where we get into images is typically the thing that the developer uses. So from like on their laptop perspective, you know, they do have to worry still about like what they're going to run it on. I would argue, I'll just tackle one that I think is a little bit nuanced that people don't think about, like the Xcode Ghost exploit. I don't know if everyone remembers that one. That was people had downloaded wrong SDK, like a false SDK, and they were building apps, uploading them to the iTunes store, or essentially the App Store, and they had they were Trojan built, apps that had gotten accepted into the App Store. And so like I would say, from a development perspective, they need to think about more than just the supply chain, although that's a huge one on my list. But they also do actually need to think about their own local development environments as well, because whatever they're running it in could also have an impact on what security and how, like whether images get injected with things that they don't know about and then uploaded into container registries without them knowing.
Exactly. Like as we were preparing for the panel, we talked about the importance of having secure images and using, I think it's called image registries. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So how does that play into this? What should the audience be thinking about in terms of that?
Well, getting back to like the images, like like in a Red Hat world, like especially with the acquisition of CoreOS, like Claire is a scanning tool that is built into like the Quay Enterprise Registry and Quay IO. So like that's like a place where you'd probably want to have a gate. Like when you push it into the registry, you'd want to have some kind of scanning to verify. Right. The Red Hat view of that world is a little bit more nuanced than just having Red Hat scan it. Typically, it's also about thinking about the kind of the trusted pieces, if you will, that come from Red Hat, but trust but verify them. So use something like OpenSCAP to scan those as they go into those registries, or as you even are building them. Actually do it in the build cycle if you can. And then the code that you put on top of it that is probably less and less trusted. So I say, you go from like the secure base image that Red Hat provides to maybe some of your own home-rolled RPMs, right, to maybe like code that you've downloaded off the internet, to maybe stuff you've written yourself. And so then there's like an entire ecosystem that Red Hat kind of supports of other vendors that are really good at scanning that other stuff. So like the unknown, stuff, essentially.
Exactly. Okay, so I want to turn to the other side of the panel. There wasn't going to be another side, but there is. You and your company focus a lot on storage. So how does the storage piece come in and complement the compute side? What you were telling me earlier.
Sure, yeah. I think, when it comes to storage and containers, you got to realize that there's two aspects to this. There's your image layers, but there's also external volumes that a storage can mount. But I just want to take a step back, and when I talk to customers, number one, the first thing that's on their mind is security. Invariably, they worry about container security. What I want to mention here is that this is an evolving ecosystem because there's a fine balance with locking something down and making it unusable, which is counter to the whole notion of cloud-native operations and cloud-native computing, which is we want to enable developers to move fast. So the struggle here is to find that balance. And why I bring this up is I've run into numerous environments where people have thought with a false sense of security, where they think they're secure, they'll lock their registry down, you can't download an image that's not been scanned or tested, and there's 10,000 ways that developers will circumvent this. They will download it to their laptop, upload the image. So don't make it so hard that your developers can't move fast. If somebody wants to break something today, still they can, which is why I think what you talked about from my perspective, and again, I want to emphasize this, we focus on storage, but I don't really see any really good runtime security tool there. So I think we can invest a lot in whitelisting solutions and container scanning solutions, but if somebody wants to do something malicious, they will work around it, and I think external volumes is a great way where somebody could do a host mount exploit. Just focusing on the container layers alone is not enough. You need to focus more on the runtime and what a process is doing and how to lock that down, and I really don't think there's a good solution there yet.
Okay.
Could I chime in one small one to add to that? Because I do agree. In fact, it's very easy for a developer to just put binaries on a bind mount them into it, and run stuff there. So,
and worst part is you can exploit that to the host. And it's a lot easier to do that compared to virtual machines. So while containers create a great isolation environment, there's enough ways to bleed out of it too today, right?
On the runtime piece, I just want to comment. I don't know that there's not a good runtime solution out there, but there isn't a great open source runtime solution out there, which I think is something that we need. And I also think that there aren't enough attacks happening right now against containers, which is great for everybody in this room, but for us to like learn enough to make something really good. So we're kind of building blindly right now as a community, being like, well, what if somebody had a reverse shell? That's great. But like, we don't know what we're actually going to be up against in 12 months from now.
Right. Good point.
Yeah,
I want Robert to have a chance.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is that, we've talked a lot about tools and about, to a certain extent, about process. And to me, one of the things that I've always noticed is that, you want to give developers flexibility, but at the same time, to provide resilient, stable, functional applications, we have to start automating more and more of our processes, right? That's the CI DevOps revolution really has sort of shown us that. And in a sense, if we have the right set of tools, which I think, companies like Red Hat and Google are providing, and Goo, you guys are providing that infrastructure security or aspects that'll help with the infrastructure security. If we can get to the point where a developer can say, all I have to focus on is my code, rather than figuring out, okay, how do I bypass running a container in a certain way so that I can do what I think I need to do? I should be able to develop my code in a way that the containerization is actually a background process to me. I shouldn't be thinking about containers. I shouldn't be thinking about running containers. I should be thinking about my application. And that's where, I mean, the shift that we're seeing towards Kubernetes as a main, management layer for that, the tooling around, registries and the resources that live within registries. I post something into a registry and it gets scanned. My code should already have been scanned at least once, right? Because as I post it into my code repository, even before it gets turned into a container, it should have been scanned. So as long as these tool chains are starting to stack together in a way that at least does that analysis for us, the end user should really not be in a position to say, oh, I'm not going to break into my container because I want to do something that effectively I know I shouldn't, right? Which may open me up to something. And that's a different way of thinking about the entire security process. We have to build the tools, we have to have the right runtimes, we have to have the storage that can support us, but we also have to have the processes for the entire deployment chain that don't open us up to the possibility of even saying, oh yeah, I'm going to go hack in and drop a new binary into my container.
Yeah. So what you're talking about now, Robert, is really getting at something that's come up before at other conferences as well, which is a cultural thing, right? So cultural meaning in the IT sense, do the DevOps people and all that, do they get what we're trying to get at? And what are the gotchas they have to think about? And I just wondered if all of you could comment a little bit on, container life cycle, what the DevOps people, how they should view this whole thing. And is there a need to do training or to convince them that they have to look out for certain things when they're dealing with containers?
I don't know who wants to tackle it.
What?
I said, who wants to tackle it?
I don't know. Do you want to tackle it? Come on, Maya.
Sure. I don't know that it's significantly different than what you're doing for your VMs. I think the main thing that is different is that your images, so containers are meant to be immutable. So once you deploy an image into production, you're not meant to go in and change it. I think that is a mental shift for a lot of people who are deploying things. If you're not already doing, tens or hundreds of deployments a day, this is a new concept to you. But maybe you're already doing that, and you're already kind of following the DevOpsy, mindset, and it makes sense. One thing I'll make a comment on, because you had it in your slide at some point, which was DevSecOps. I think security people hate this word because it doesn't really, it feels like it doesn't mean anything, because you're like, what do you mean I can't just DevOps security? It's like either you're doing security or you're not doing security. So the word that I've heard used is continuous security, the idea being just add security all of the time. That's always a good thing. That sounds like a good idea.
I think I picked it up at RSA.
That might be where.
That is where I picked it.
It sounds like an RSA thing.
It does sound like an RSA thing. Scott, did you have an additional comment? I think you did.
No.
No. He takes pass. All right. Guys over here. Cultural issues.
I think maybe this is related to what Maya was saying, but I think, look, for me, the way I boil it down into culturally is that there's unintentional risks that happen with when it comes to securing your environment, and there's intentional risks. And I think quite often, mostly in an enterprise, when I run into a security issue, it's been unintentional. Somebody did something by mistake. It's a rare event, and it would be a major event if somebody did something intentionally, right? But most of the problems that happen are from people not knowing what they're doing. And so I think like when managing images and layers and trying to lock down containers, that sort of can mitigate the unintentional issues that people can cause. But when it comes to intentional risks and really securing your environment, I think more and more focus on that runtime thing to me makes more sense, because that's where people can actually bypass whatever unintentional safeguards you've put in place.
Robert, any other comments?
Yeah, I think the cultural point is really clear to me. You know, I've talked to a lot of operators that are trying to understand how to deal with this container influx that they're suddenly being handed. As well, you have a container environment. Maybe I, as a developer, actually stood up my own Kubernetes environment or Docker Swarm or whatever it is that I did to actually get containers loaded into this environment on top of VMs. And now I am running something that is well outside the bounds of what many old school operators, and old school in my mind is just somebody who thinks of operating things at the VM or the machine level, right? Because, you know, as Maya pointed out, containers are supposed to be immutable. They're supposed to be something that shows up and goes away whenever you need to deploy a new one. It doesn't matter. These things are supposed to take care of themselves. And yet a lot of people are looking at containers and saying, oh, well, that's the new shiny, so I have to take my application and my VM and put it into a container and then I'll run it. And now don't touch it because I'm running my application and that's going to run for 6 years, right? And it's like, no, that's the wrong approach. So this is the big cultural shift. And once you can make that cultural shift, then I think a lot of these tools, like you said, runtime, security, the tools that we have for making sure that the images that we have available, which we're hopefully posting every single day into the registries, are being validated and being secured. These things can now really take effect and be effective because, you know, to Gu's point, it changes that unintentional gap, right? It sort of helps us at least shrink that unintentional gap. And now we can focus on runtime security where there really is, I think, a lot of work that can be done to further enhance the security aspects. Whether you go Kata or you go gvisor or any of these other sort of technologies.
I'm hearing more about the runtime issues now.
One thing I'd add to that on the application side is I think that's a really good point. Culturally, I think especially if there's a security team in place, they need to break outside of the machine-centric boundary because now with especially containers, your application is not just one machine, right? So it spans multiple machines, multiple zones. So if somebody says, what is the footprint of my security breach? You can't take a machine-centric approach to that. So that's another culture.
That was old school security. Here's my server. I'm going to put it in a room. You know?
Yeah, and I wanted to add, like you kind of piqued me when you said, I think it's good, the idea that there are intentional and unintentional security issues. Like, so I did government security and have been through a bazillion trainings for that, you know, back in the day, for NASA for 7 years. So I've been through a ton of DoD training, and you sparked me. So back then, over 50% of internal, you know, hacks were internal. So like I had to deal with ITAR data, and basically it would always get stolen by people that got hired, and, you know, shipped off to some other country. So with the and when your point of we haven't really learned yet everything that's going to happen, I do have a theory here that with the democratization of code and more developers being involved, and honestly a new set of people being involved, because there are a lot more developers than there are sysadmins. Historically, we were very sensitive with sysadmins, and we even did log the changes they made. Like if they added a user or deleted a user or did something, we would be like, wait a minute, they accessed that data, why? And you know, so we are going to have to learn a new set of controls probably for a much wider group of people, because the unintentional probably just hasn't been discovered yet, or the intentional probably just hasn't been discovered yet with programmers would be my guess. And then I would say one last thing, like if you think about protection from policies, you know, which is training of developers to make sure that they do secure things, and then also enforcement in a technical way, you know, technical control, but then also just auditing of everything. Because when they do eventually do something intentionally, we at least want to be able to track
So
them.
I see the word auditing has cropped up organically, and in fact, auditing is an important part of all of this, to have a feedback system on what went wrong there. Go ahead.
I was going to make some comments on what I think is better about security with containers, other than things like, you know, Kata and gvisor. Your patch management is way easier. Just patch every time the container redeploys. Wow, you don't have to like take things offline on Sundays at 2 a.m. anymore. Like, what a change. But you have to put everything in place to make that possible, right? Because if you're not actually doing it, then you're not benefiting. And then the other point that I'll see is so yes, all your security people have to learn new concepts, but they had to learn new concepts when they were learning like Jenkins or when they were learning whatever anyways. Like, that's not new. The benefit that you get now, and I think that this only kind of clicked for me a couple months ago, is everybody on VMs or on bare metal is doing their own super custom thing on-prem, right? And now you're using OpenStack or using CNCF tools or whatever you're using, and you put in 2 developers and you get back 10 developers worth of work because everybody else is building towards the same thing. So as long as you're not doing something super snowflakey, there's a lot of interesting security benefits that everybody else is giving you too.
It does sound like there's a little bit of preparation here, right?
Well,
I mean, you can't just like throw these things out there. You really have to think through what all the possible issues are.
Yeah, I want to add to your thing about the patching. So the patching becomes very easy. The preparing for the patching becomes actually a little bit harder, if you ask me. So something that came up, I taught a very deep technical containers internals lab on Monday, and one of the questions that came up after the lab was around how do I build a set of container images for my enterprise? Like we've got like 1,000 different apps we need to support. How do I build a structure around building container images? So if we go to 1,000 different containers for 1,000 different, or let's call it 1 for 1 for point of simple math. We had 1 container image for each app. That's 1,000 different container images. If we do it only that way, and that's the way we build everything, we now are back in the 90s from a patching perspective. The preparation, we have to go to every single app team and ask them and go down a spreadsheet and check, did you patch your container? Did you patch your container? Did you patch your container? That sucks. We don't want that. So we've got to build some kind of tree structure where, for example, if we need to patch OpenSSL, we patch it one time and it's dry. It's just like a function. It gets inherited by everybody. So the app containers all need to be built on some kind of intermediary layers, which then need to be built on some eventually like Adam and Eve layer, which is what I call it. Like, you need to have like a central point of control that you bring in so that we can put really important things there and patch them only once and things here that only these ones care about only once. And you want to be able to build a tree structure that you only have to patch once and then you don't have to notify 1,000 app teams.
Well, I get the tree structure, but you're kind of implying there should be some level of automation, I think.
Oh, there absolutely, and then in addition, there absolutely has to be automation on top of that so that then when you patch in that one place, you press a button and everything below it gets patched automatically.
But that won't work in all environments, right? Because as people go to more container approaches for building their applications, start using languages like Go that you can potentially compile statically, your container is one binary, right? So suddenly those libraries have to be handled outside of the container lifecycle because the only container lifecycle you have is put the binary in the package effectively, right?
Without dynamic.
So
I agree.
So in
but
dynamic
the web
languages,
server
I
may
agree,
still,
right? But I think we're seeing this shift towards even different models for how the communication happens. So now suddenly the communication path has to come into the security layer as well. Right, so things like Istio and Linkerd and the service mesh-like layers, but all of this comes along with changes in how we're developing our applications. Right, the old application models are shifting, and as they shift, our culture has to shift to understand where those different resources start to tie together.
Right. This could be dangerous, but I think we should let the audience ask a question because they might be thinking, when are these guys going to let me ask a question? You should, and then we can come back to some other stuff. Does anybody have a question on this section, the cultural thing? Eli, I think you have a question. No? No, you don't? Okay. All right. Oh, there's a question. Go on.
We're supposed to use the mics, yeah?
Yeah.
Anyways, so I'm rolling out, well, I've been rolling out cloud, but now containers to an incredibly heterogeneous conglomerate environment. So lots and lots of things of various levels of terrifying to, oh, that's pretty cool. And the things that I've seen that look like they'll save us are making sure the app team knows that if they're going to live in containers, they have to do CI and do regression testing every time I age out their base or the next time their thing spins when the container dies, because they die all the time by design, that all their stuff's going to maybe work. And then the other thing is actually the earlier thread with the security, which is the biggest challenge that I've had as things have evolved, trying to help the security team understand that they're now a developer team and that the tools that they need to be creating and providing are application components, as opposed to going and buying a RASP off the shelf. Because those things aren't meaningful when your attack surface is a bunch of layered applications, which is what these all are.
So that was a comment. Do you, in addition, have a question?
Oh. So what have you seen in this space for helping these large, complex organizations spread the word for CI, and what sort of effective tooling have you seen around security for these kinds of workloads?
So I can give you what I've seen from successful deployments, and really I think the others on the panel should really chime in here because they're hardcore security experts and focused on this. But I've seen where people tend to focus on their infrastructure where they treat a container as truly a container, and its environment should be secure. So what I mean by that is I've seen some good deployments where they've focused on a secure base layer, where they have the necessary tools in place that can manage the security of the components that are running within it, assume nothing externally, that they don't assume a fully chaotic environment, but that there's some level of security externally at the host and at the upbound infrastructure layer, but they try and isolate the security and securing the runtime processes as best as possible from within the container. I've seen a lot of successful deployments like this, especially in the government space. I don't know if this is pervasive to everybody else.
Well, I'd say, so what I've seen in the enterprise, because this is kind of our bailiwick, Red Hat. So I've talked to literally probably, not exaggerating, thousands of customers around that thing. And to be very transparent up front, everyone's still figuring it out. I mean, but I would say containers are not a either or. You don't just like get rid of your layer 7, firewall that blocks certain things. You still have that, right? Like it's defense in depth. So like all of the runtime performance, security, architecture things that you worry about now don't necessarily go away. You still have them. Again, in my mind, containers are a tip of the iceberg, right? They make it really nice and easy to consume. It goes to a consumption model where the consumption is very easy. But the preparation of that consumption is now a product model. Yeah. And like when you're a product team, products require a lot more love and care than just some technology that you produced internally. Like, so you've now got to have documentation and life cycles and like, essentially have to manage it for a long time and figure out what its actual value proposition is and stay true to that promise to the end consumer. And so some of that is, yes, some of it is scanning tools. Yes, some of it is, but it's still the runtime stuff is all the same stuff that you've always had to worry about.
So it just seems like this is a think differently thing. I mean, it's working for people. It's supporting usable workloads. It's not at its beginning stage, but neither have we seen everywhere it's going to run, and so we haven't encountered all.
No, because what happens is if they're deploying new apps, what the world I just mentioned is easy to get to. You can go product-centric and understand that, right? But then the next question is, well, how do I leverage the value of this really expensive thing I just bought, right? Like I've trained people to use OpenShift. I've bought OpenShift. I've bought a bunch of hardware, or I've provisioned stuff on Amazon, and I've learned how to do all this stuff, which is an investment in and of itself. And then you're like, what else can I do? Like the next question that always gets asked is, what else can I put in containers because I want to get value out of this really expensive thing I just bought? Right. And then that's when you run into the problems that he's talking about. Sure. And to be honest, we're little by little, we're tackling them.
Okay, Maya, you want to comment?
Yeah. I have a bit of a weird perspective because I have one foot in Google, which is like, ideal, everything works together, land internally, everything is custom built. And like one foot in reality of like seeing the security of major banks and healthcare companies. Yeah. I don't know that there is a best practice right now. There's a lot of things that you can want to do. Like you can want to scan all your images and you can want to rebuild every night and you can want to do all these things. I'll make two predictions, I guess. One is I think we're going to see a lot of disruption in the CI/CD space because this thing of bandaging together all these pieces is just not working for anyone. So there's just potential to completely disrupt how we do that. And then in what you were just commenting on, like firewalls and whatnot, the major complaint I hear from like CISOs right now is like, I don't want to buy another solution just for containers. Like the one I have for VMs should work for containers too. And I'm like, I agree, it should. And I think a lot of vendors are going to wake up to that and start building things for containers.
Yeah, I understand. In fact, there are a couple questions on this side. Could we?
Well, I was just going to
might run out of time.
Comment on that.
Okay, sure.
And I think we have a real opportunity because I think security in the past really was either policy-driven, post-deployment driven, or security at the edge, right? So I mean, we talk about firewalls. Why do we have firewalls? Well, because it's too complicated to try to deal with that massive thing that we built. So we'll see if we can't stop most of it at the edge. Right? We have a real opportunity with containers because the process of building containers, especially as more and more people understand I would say sort of the right way, containers are a process container, right? As we start to understand that, we can build into that security from the very ground level up. Right? It's not just let's see what we got at the end, right? We should be doing that code scanning. We should be doing code scanning as we're developing, but we can now actually take those security policies as we build the application.
And kind of rethink the whole thing.
Yeah, I don't want to read secrets in the open anymore. I want them to be encrypted so that they're only in memory in the container space, right? So there's things like that we can really do that change it, and that will make it better over time.
Okay, I don't want to rush you, but I'm looking at the time. You want to ask your question, sir?
CI/CD, best practices, the scanning is so important. I've still got developers that don't know what a SQL injection is, and they're writing lousy code. They're statically linking with libraries that have vulnerabilities against them. The people building my CI/CD are not security people. You know, we have the security organization way over here in the corner, you know, with the windows closed, and we have developers in one corner and the tool builders in another corner. Is there anything here about the container architecture that's going to help me, or do I just have yet another problem?
You want to hit it?
I'll start, which is I think you can get rid of a lot of the common issues by giving developers some tools that so I say tools loosely. Things like if you give your developers secure base images, right? And that could be something that your security team vets and signs off on that you update like as often as you want to, and they have to build something from that. If you give them a set of libraries or packages that they can use that you've scanned for and you've already done, basically you're giving them a private set of things, pull anything you want from here and we're not going to flag it. Right, we've managed the security for that. That's a big deal. I think it's hard, but if you had a magic wand, you can make that happen. And then in terms of scanning for vulnerabilities, if there's some tools out there, some open source tools, Claire is great. You can do things like look for common CVEs, like known CVEs in the CVE database. You can look for things like users running as root. You can use containers running as root. You can look for things like, you know, is my image too old or hasn't been built in a long time? Like those are things that I would look for that are super low-hanging fruit but have a really, really big security impact.
Yeah, and
one thing I'd mention on the cultural part is you mentioned your windows are closed. I would say open the windows, because part of this is the security team needs to realize that as people are embracing containers, there's more of a social aspect to this where they're really going for the agile environment where you can't treat security as an external, I'll come in and scan it at the host later, you can't talk to me. That's not going to work in this environment. That's counter to why we're moving to containers in the first place. So the more your security teams, if they're really not talking to the developers, I'd say culturally, for me, that's a red flag right there.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd also add, I agree with Maya that like there's not really any that I'm aware of any like all-encompassing CI/CD solution that would like warn you on all these best practices. Like everything she mentioned, I agree 100%. And it's typically I think about it like there's fully built container image you can get from somebody like Red Hat or wherever. Then you can get RPMs, which is the next layer down. Then you can get libraries, like your own libraries, like maybe from GitHub, which to me starts making me feel less warm and fuzzy. Then there's like stuff that's just like pulled down from wherever, who knows what it is, and something they wrote, maybe even like you mentioned, they can add their own exploits. Part of that is like bias towards consumption. That's a cloud paradigm, if you will, like API, container image, you know, RPM file, you know, whatever you wrote yourself. That's kind of the direction I would say is probably a best practice. The second thing is a lot of these are like as I mentioned, there's technical, there's you know, like we mentioned, processes that you can put in place, or even education. Like he said, I would probably have the security team talk to them and educate them because part of their code reviews and things like that is all about like looking for things that are wrong, and if they don't know what to look for, then they won't know what to do. So part of that is education of those processes. Technical controls can't be everything. Like technical controls are just a codification of what we learned in processes is even just a codification of what we learned, and it's going to be a continuous cycle where we figure out that we did something wrong that actually nobody else knew was wrong, and then we have to write that down and then capture it and keep adding it to the process and eventually codifying it.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to add, which I forgot to add, is that a lot of money is being invested. There are industry stats along the lines of $3.5 billion for the containers alone, and another $1.5 billion just for the orchestration and other management software. So what we see when you stand way back and say, hey, something's happening here. Something is happening with containers. That's why this issue is becoming so pressing at this time, because now it's going mainstream, and we have to do more to secure it. Maya, you had a comment?
I was just going to make a quick comment, which is like if the security team doesn't have the ability to enforce the use of those images, and if the security team can't build the right images, then it's useless.
That's a failure of culture.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. I want to ask this gentleman to weigh in. Actually, I know you're a container expert, right? So go ahead and ask your question.
Hi. We know we've had a handful of CVEs in Kubernetes and OpenShift. So there's a question for Scott and Maya. So obviously, what have we learned from those CVEs, and what can we do better in the open source projects, whether it is Kubernetes or in OpenStack, to make things better so we reduce the scope of a problem?
You can start.
Yeah, I'll comment because I get to send some emails that say there are CVEs. One piece of this is like how much easier can we make it for you to patch? So can we build things into I'm thinking of Kubernetes. Can we build things into Kubernetes releases so that you can just get them very easily and make them work? Like I look at the last I'll say big Kubernetes vulnerability that came out in I want to say January, and we released a patch and it broke a bunch of people. And that made me really sad because people were using this feature as not intended, but it still broke them. And so, yeah, exactly, the volume and then they couldn't patch because like it was a mess, right? And so I think there's a piece that needs to be done in Kubernetes around, we have this idea of Kubernetes conformance, which is the idea that I can take my workload running on one Kubernetes over here on AWS and move it over here to Google, move it over here to OpenStack, and everything should just work, right? I should have some tests that make it all work. I think we need to do something similar for security patches that we deploy to Kubernetes. I think the other thing is that we don't have that many eyes at the end of the day looking at this, right? We have a handful of people over at Red Hat, a handful of over Google, Microsoft, Amazon looking at these things. And yes, people care a lot, but Kubernetes has become such a massive thing that like we need to almost do like a complete security review and have people constantly looking at it. Right. So one thing that has been proposed that I'm still trying to make happen is like a Kubernetes bug bounty. I'm not saying that would a Kubernetes bug bounty. Oh. I don't think it would solve all of our problems, right? Bug bounties are not the way of fixing your vulnerabilities, but it would certainly maybe get people who wouldn't otherwise look at this code to look at it.
Okay, so I just have to warn everybody that I think, am I right, guys? We have about 5 more minutes? 4 minutes, in fact, and we're getting to the lightning.
Oh, no worries.
So this will be a quick talk.
I'll add a 30-second add-on.
Okay.
Something that people rarely want to comment on publicly is that, again, we haven't done this a long time. Like we haven't been doing this a long time. There haven't been there's no red team attacking like Kubernetes right now. Like it would be nice, and it's being talked about to add something like that where we actually have a team that's like attacking it and trying to find these things ahead of time. Okay. Another one that people don't talk about is that there hasn't actually been an exploit in the wild that actually got out yet. Like, yeah, well.
Just wait.
Yeah, it's a long story. We won't get into it. But long story short is we know it probably has some things we would like to attack it in.
Okay, we have to talk about that after. But what I want everybody to do, Sky, actually you first, because I want to go down the line here, with the lightning round. What is your advice to the attendees as to kind of prioritizing what they should do first when, reviewing their container security policies? What would be the most pressing thing they could do?
So it's funny because I have to typically think about this holistically more than just security. I typically think about it in 3 paradigms: security, performance, and architecture, because all 3 affect everything.
Sure,
they're all
of course.
And then I think of it, the next layer down, I always say is, all right, there are all the normal things you still have to care about: performance, security, like network, all of the normal things you worry about because they're just processes. But the 4 new things you need to think about, these are the 4 new paradigms, are like container image, container registry, container host, and orchestration platform.
That's helpful.
So like those 4 things, and then each of those have a rabbit hole that you have to go down and then tackle the performance, security, and architecture of each of those and make sure that you're doing them right.
You just gave me an assignment to write. Okay. Maya, your priority list here?
I'll be really practical. Just run the latest version of Kubernetes, assuming you're running on Kubernetes. You get the latest patches and you get the latest security features. I have to make the pitch. You could use a hosted provider. It's a little bit easier. Like you get a lot of stuff for free that you don't have to deal with yourself, which is kind of nice.
And they have to worry about it.
And then we have to worry about it instead. And then I think there's a lot of, I don't have a solution here yet, but there's a lot of work being done in Kubernetes to make better secure defaults. So if you have opinions on that or not, please do contribute and provide opinions as to what you'd like to see. Because we do want to make it easier.
Exactly. Okay, this side.
Yeah, apart from everything that we've talked about here at the panel, the only thing that I would add, stress on, is that part of your container security vulnerabilities lie outside of the container itself, right? Because there are things like external volume mounts, so your data can be outside, can be consumed as binaries, as data. So when you think about storage, it's not a separate storage team or a security team or an apps team. It's think about things holistically.
To the extent possible, Robert?
Yeah, and I think my thing is, look at how security becomes a part of your development process rather than an add-on, something that happens after the fact.
So start early.
Start early, start often.
Yeah. Well, this is going so well. I could go for another half hour, but I don't think we can. So I want to ask you to join me in thanking the panel. They were excellent. And we'll be around for a few minutes if you have additional questions. So thank you very much. That was great. Thanks very much.